She swallowed hard. You're the new owner. Jonathan nodded. That's right. He let that sink in before continuing, his voice calm but unwavering. And do you know how I got here? How I ended up owning this hotel? Emily shook her head quickly. No, sir. Jonathan leaned against the counter slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. I built my career from the ground up. I wasn't handed this. I wasn't born into wealth. Everything I have, I worked for. My mother. He motioned toward Margaret, who was still watching quietly. Sacrificed everything so I could have the opportunities she never did. So when I see someone like you treat her as if she doesn't belong here, I take that very, very personally. Emily's hands clenched at her sides. I didn't mean. Jonathan held up a hand, cutting her off. I don't want excuses. I want you to understand what just happened here. You looked at my mother and assumed she didn't belong. Not because of anything she did, but because of how she looks. And that? His voice dropped lower, quieter, but somehow even more powerful. That is unacceptable. Emily's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of her mistake pressing down on her, but she didn't know what to say. She had thought she was just doing her job, but now, standing in front of the man who held her future in his hands, she realized how wrong she had been. Margaret finally stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her son's arm. Jonathan, she said softly. He exhaled slowly, glancing at his mother. There was no anger on her face, only that same quiet patience she had always carried. Emily watched, her heart pounding. The air in the room felt charged, like something was about to happen, something that would change everything. Jonathan held his mother's gaze for a long moment, his jaw still tense, but the way she looked at him, calm, steady, was enough to make him take a breath. Margaret had always had that effect on him, even when he was a boy. She had taught him strength, but also patience. And right now her eyes were telling him something. Asterisk, choose your next move carefully, asterisk. Emily shifted on her feet, feeling the tension in the air thicken. Sir, she started again, her voice barely above a whisper. I really am sorry. It was a mistake. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. A mistake? He let the word linger between them. You see, Emily, mistakes are things like misplacing a room key or charging the wrong credit card. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Emily's lips parted, but before she could speak, a new voice cut through the silence. Mr. Carter, is there a problem here? Everyone turned. A middle-aged man in a navy blue suit strode toward them, his expression tight with concern. He had the polished, rehearsed smile of someone used to smoothing over uncomfortable situations. Jonathan recognized him instantly, Michael Lawson, the hotel's general manager. Jonathan's eyes darkened slightly. Michael, he said, his tone cool. Perfect timing. Michael's gaze flickered toward Margaret, and for a split second, something unreadable passed across his face. Then he turned to Emily, who looked as if she might collapse under the weight of all the eyes on her. What's going on? Michael asked carefully. Jonathan folded his arms, watching him. Emily here decided my mother didn't belong in asterisk, my asterisk hotel. She denied her reservation, refused to check again, and told her to leave. All without bothering to verify the facts. Michael's face paled. I see, he said slowly, his polished exterior cracking just a bit. He turned sharply to Emily. Is this true? Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again, her eyes darting between the two men. I didn't mean. Michael held up a hand. I don't want to hear it. Then he turned back to Jonathan, his smile returning, though weaker than before. Mr. Carter, please accept my deepest apologies. This is absolutely unacceptable, and I assure you it will be handled immediately. Jonathan didn't reply right away. He studied Michael, something calculating behind his eyes. Then, as if making a decision in real time, he took a step closer. "Handled how?" Jonathan asked. Michael hesitated. "Well, I'll personally ensure disciplinary action is taken." Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Disciplinary action," he repeated. "Interesting." Margaret watched the exchange with a knowing look, but she said nothing, letting her son take the lead. Michael cleared his throat. "I promise you, sir, this does not reflect the values of Grand Haven Hotel. I take full responsibility." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "Do you?" Michael froze. "Excuse me." The older officer exhaled slowly, then turned back to the woman. "Ma'am," he said, "let's get you home." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't yell. They just watched, taking it all in. Because this wasn't just about one moment. It was about accountability, about choices, about the way power could shift in an instant. And just like that, the story wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what would happen next. The officer stood frozen, his badge and gun no longer in his possession. His face, once full of authority, now held something different: uncertainty, maybe even regret. The crowd, still holding their phones high, captured every second of it. But no one cheered. No one celebrated. It wasn't about that. It was about witnessing something rarely seen: consequences. The older officer gave a slight nod to the man in the suit, acknowledging the decision that had just been made. Then he turned back to the elderly woman, who was still standing with the help of another officer. Her eyes, filled with confusion, drifted from face to face. She looked at the man who had spoken up for her, the neighbor who had recognized her in the middle of all this chaos. There was something familiar in her expression, like a memory trying to resurface. "Do you remember me?" the man asked gently. She blinked, tilting her head slightly. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "You live next door." It wasn't much, but it was enough to bring a wave of emotion over him. The older officer nodded. "Let's get her checked out, make sure she's okay," he said. One of the other officers, the one who had helped her stand, nodded and guided her toward a nearby patrol car, not to arrest her, but to get her somewhere safe. The man in the suit turned away, speaking into his phone as he walked back toward his car. He had done what he came to do. The officer who had lost his badge stood there for another moment before stepping back, his posture stiff, his gaze locked on the ground. Without his badge, without his authority, he was just another man in the crowd now. Slowly, the energy in the street shifted. The crowd began to disperse, some still murmuring, others walking away in silence. The woman was safe, and the officer who had used force against her was no longer in power. It didn't erase what had happened, but it meant something. It meant people had seen. It meant the truth had been recorded. And it meant that for once, there were consequences. As the patrol car carrying the elderly woman pulled away, her neighbor watched until it was out of sight. Then he took a deep breath and turned, walking back toward home. And just like that, the night moved on. But this story, would not be forgotten. The doors of the luxurious Grand Haven Hotel swung open, and an elderly woman stepped inside, her hands trembling slightly from age, but her posture still graceful. Dressed in a modest yet elegant outfit, she carried a small suitcase, her eyes scanning the lobby with quiet admiration. This place had changed so much since the last time she had been here. She had memories in this building, ones that stretched back decades. But before she could take another step, a sharp voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am, can I help you?" The receptionist behind the front desk, a young woman with neatly styled blonde hair, barely looked up from her computer screen. Her tone wasn't warm or welcoming. Instead, it was laced with impatience. The elderly woman smiled politely. "Yes, dear. I have a reservation. My name is Margaret Johnson." The receptionist finally glanced up, her expression shifting the moment she saw the older woman's dark skin. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face before she plastered on a tight-lipped smile. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is a 5-star hotel." Margaret's smile faltered slightly, but she remained calm. "Yes, I'm quite sure. My son booked the room for me." The receptionist let out a small sigh and began typing. After a few seconds, she shook her head dramatically. "I don't see your name here. Maybe you made a mistake. This hotel has a strict policy. We can't just let anyone in." Margaret's heart sank. She knew exactly what was happening. She had lived long enough to recognize the subtle and not so subtle ways people like her were treated differently. "Can you check again, please?" she asked gently. But the receptionist was already shaking her head, a fake look of sympathy on her face. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Margaret hesitated. She could argue, but she was tired. Tired of always having to prove herself, tired of people looking at her as if she didn't belong. With a quiet sigh, she turned toward the door. Just as she reached for the handle, a deep, commanding voice echoed through the lobby. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" The receptionist's face turned pale as she looked up, right into the eyes of the hotel's new owner. Margaret's son. The room fell silent. The receptionist's fingers froze above her keyboard, her face draining of color as she turned to face the tall, well-dressed man standing near the entrance. His sharp suit, confident stance, and piercing gaze made it clear he was someone important. But it wasn't just his appearance that made the air shift. There was a presence about him, a quiet authority that demanded attention. Margaret turned slowly, and the moment her eyes met his, something warm flickered across her face. "Jonathan," she said softly, almost as if she couldn't believe it. The receptionist's head snapped between them, confusion twisting her expression. You know him." Jonathan took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning his mother's face before shifting to the receptionist. His jaw clenched slightly, but he kept his voice calm. "Yes, I do." The young woman swallowed hard, clearly trying to assess the situation. "Sir, I was just handling a misunderstanding. This woman came in claiming she had a reservation, but her name isn't in the system." Jonathan didn't take his eyes off her. "And your first response was to kick her out." The receptionist fumbled for words. I was just following protocol. We have a lot of important guests, and we can't have people walking in off the street expecting a free stay." Margaret stood quietly, watching the exchange with a knowing look. She had been on the receiving end of this kind of treatment more times than she could count, but she had never expected to experience it in a hotel that, unknown to the receptionist, now belonged to her son. Jonathan took a deep breath, clearly trying to control the anger simmering just beneath his calm exterior. He turned back to his mother. Did she even check properly? Margaret gave a small, tired smile. "I don't think she got that far." Jonathan turned back to the receptionist, his voice dropping to a quiet but firm tone. "Look again, now." The receptionist's hands shook slightly as she clicked through the system, her breath unsteady. Jonathan watched her carefully, his sharp eyes catching every nervous movement. He could tell she had made up her mind about his mother the moment she walked in. And that didn't sit right with him. Emily's breath caught. "A choice?" "You can leave," Jonathan said. "Or you can stay, but only if you're willing to learn. That means training, accountability, and real change. If you think this job is just about checking people in and out, then this isn't the place for you." Emily swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. She had expected to be fired on the spot. But this was something different. It wasn't just punishment. It was an opportunity. Margaret, who had remained silent, finally stepped forward, her soft voice breaking through the tension. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't punishment," she said gently. "It's growth." Emily's eyes welled up with tears. She nodded quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to stay. I want to do better." Jonathan studied her for a long moment before giving a small nod. "Then prove it." Emily wiped at her eyes and nodded again. Michael, still gripping the envelope in his hands, scoffed under his breath and turned toward the exit. "This hotel is going to fall apart without me," he muttered. Jonathan didn't even look at him. "We'll be just fine." As Michael pushed through the doors, the tension in the room finally lifted. The employees who had been watching scattered, whispering among themselves. Margaret looked up at her son, pride shining in her eyes. Jonathan turned to her, his expression softening. "Your room's ready, Mom." Margaret chuckled. "I suppose it is." Jonathan held out his arm, and Margaret took it, letting her son lead her toward the elevator. As they walked, she squeezed his arm gently. "You handled that well." Jonathan smirked. "I learned from the best." As the elevator doors slid shut, Margaret looked at him with warmth. "This hotel is going to be something special." Jonathan smiled. "It already is." The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, and as it ascended, Margaret looked over at her son, her eyes filled with quiet pride. "You know," she said, her voice warm, "I didn't expect all that to happen today." Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. "Neither did I." He glanced down at her. "But I couldn't just let it slide. Not when it was you." Margaret patted his arm gently. "It shouldn't have to be me for you to care." Jonathan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "And it won't be," he said firmly. "This hotel is going to change, Mom. I'll make sure of it." Margaret smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I believe you." When the doors opened, they stepped out into a beautifully designed hallway. Jonathan led her to a spacious suite, one of the best in the hotel. The room had a stunning view of the city skyline, and the soft golden light of the setting sun bathed everything in a warm glow. Margaret walked slowly toward the window, taking it all in. "You really did it," she murmured, almost to herself. Jonathan stepped beside her, hands in his pockets. "We did it," he corrected. "I wouldn't be here without you." Margaret turned to him, her eyes glistening just a little. "That's what mothers do, baby. We lift you up so you can go farther than we ever could." Jonathan didn't say anything at first, just reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. Back downstairs, the atmosphere in the lobby had shifted. The tension from earlier had faded, replaced with quiet murmurs of change. Employees whispered about what had happened, and a few exchanged looks, realizing that things at Grand Haven Hotel would never be the same again. Emily remained behind the front desk, standing a little taller now. She still had a long way to go, but something in her had changed. She wasn't just another employee anymore. She had something to prove. As Jonathan rode back down the elevator, he exhaled deeply, feeling a sense of purpose settle in his chest. Owning a hotel wasn't just about business. It was about people. And from that day forward, Grand Haven Hotel would stand for something more. When he stepped into the lobby, a few employees straightened their postures, eyes flicking to him with a mix of respect and curiosity. He met their gazes and gave a small nod. "Let's get to work." Jonathan took another slow step forward. "I asked if *U** take full responsibility." His voice was calm, but there was something sharp beneath it. "Because from where I'm standing, this isn't just about Emily. This is about the culture in this hotel. The way people like my mother are treated the second they step inside. Michael swallowed hard. I assure you, this was an isolated incident. Jonathan arched a brow. Was it? He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around. On the display was security footage, clear as day, of Emily dismissing Margaret without checking the system. Jonathan swiped again, revealing more clips. Different guests, different days. Employees glancing at certain guests with the same dismissive expression Emily had worn. Guests being ignored, being brushed aside. Emily gasped. Michael's face turned ghostly white. You were saying? Jonathan asked smoothly. The lobby was so quiet that even the hum of the air conditioning felt deafening. Emily looked like she might burst into tears, but Jonathan barely spared her a glance now. His attention was fully on Michael. Tell me something, Michael, Jonathan continued. How long have you been in charge here? Michael's throat bobbed. 3 years. Jonathan nodded slowly. 3 years, he echoed. And you expect me to believe this is the first time something like this has happened? Michael didn't answer. He couldn't. Margaret exhaled softly, watching as the weight of the situation settled over the room. Jonathan had come here expecting to check in on his mother. Instead, he had uncovered something much bigger. And now, all eyes were on him, waiting to see what he would do next. Michael's mouth opened, but no words came out. The color had drained from his face, and for the first time, he looked truly rattled. He had built a career on smooth-talking his way out of difficult situations, but this was different. There was nowhere to run, no excuse to hide behind. The security footage on Jonathan's phone spoke louder than any words ever could. Jonathan let the silence stretch. He wanted Michael to feel the weight of this moment, to understand that the problem ran deeper than one receptionist making a bad decision. This was a pattern, a culture that had been allowed to exist under his leadership. Emily shifted beside him, her breathing uneven. Sir, She started, but Jonathan didn't look at her. His attention was still on Michael. You've had 3 years, Jonathan said finally, his voice even but firm. 3 years to build a hotel that treats all guests with dignity. And yet, here we are. Michael inhaled sharply. I take full responsibility. I can fix this. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. Fix it? He let the word settle. Michael, I don't need you to fix this. I need you gone asterisk. Michael's eyes widened. Sir. You're fired, Jonathan said, his tone calm but unwavering. Effective immediately. A stunned silence filled the lobby. Emily let out a small gasp, and a few employees standing nearby exchanged shocked glances. Michael took a step back, his mouth opening and closing like he was still trying to process what had just happened. You can't be serious, Michael finally stammered. Jonathan raised a brow. I don't say things I don't mean. Michael straightened his tie, his hands trembling slightly. You don't understand the logistics. I understand perfectly, Jonathan interrupted. You were trusted to run this hotel, and instead, you let it become a place where guests like my mother are disrespected. That's not the kind of business I run. Michael exhaled shakily, his mind racing. Then suddenly, something flickered in his expression. A smirk. A quiet, desperate confidence. You might own this hotel, Jonathan, but there are contracts, agreements. You can't just fire me on the spot without legal consequences. Jonathan smiled, small, knowing. You're right. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out an envelope, holding it between 2 fingers. That's why I had my legal team review everything before I got here. Michael's smirk faded. Jonathan handed him the envelope. Your termination papers. You violated company policies, and based on the evidence I have, you've done it more than once. Consider this your official notice. Michael snatched the envelope, his face twisted in disbelief. He opened it, scanned the contents, and then, for the first time, looked truly defeated. He knew there was no way out of this. Jonathan turned back to Emily, who looked like she was bracing for her own downfall. As for you, Jonathan said, his voice measured, I'm giving you a choice.